All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the most explosive, absolute powder keg rebellions in all of history. We're going to explore the fascinating world of the ancient Celts, zooming in on an era where massive empires clashed and absolute legends were born. And anchoring this whole story is one of history's most compelling, unyielding figures, Queen Boudica. To set the stage, you have to understand that Roman historians were literally terrified of the fierce women of the Celtic world. Look at this account from the 4th century Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus. He wrote that a Celtic woman could strike blows mingled with kicks as if they were missiles sent from a catapult. I mean, that tells us right out of the gate that the Romans were facing a culture playing by completely different rules, especially when it came to gender and warfare.
100,000. Let that staggering number sink in for a second. That represents the estimated size of the British rebel army led by a single woman against Rome in 60 CE, an army of 100,000 warriors, all unified under Boudica's banner to take on the most ruthlessly efficient military machine the ancient world had ever seen.
Section 1. The Warrior Queen. You see, Boudica's name has basically become synonymous with fierce, uncompromising resistance. Back in 60 to 61 CE, she led this massive, truly terrifying uprising against the Roman occupation of Britannia. The backstory is brutal. After her husband died, the Romans completely ignored his will, seized her tribe's property, and then violently assaulted her and her daughters. In response, she united her tribe, the Iceni, along with neighboring tribes, and kicked off an absolute war of vengeance. But before we map out the devastating path of her rebellion, we really need to pause, zoom out, and ask ourselves what kind of culture actually produces a leader like her.
That brings us to Section 2, Inside the Celtic World.
To really understand the society that produced Boudica, we have to look back. The Celts weren't just some sudden random phenomenon. They actually originated in Central Europe during the Iron Age. As we track this timeline, around 800 BCE, you see the Hallstatt culture emerge. They were known for early trade networks and these really elaborate elite burials. That eventually evolves into the Latane culture by 450 BCE, which gives us that incredible swirling Celtic art and seriously advanced metalworking. By the 1st century BCE, they had spread out everywhere, developing advanced iron weapons and locking down massive trade connections across Europe.
But here is a super crucial point. They were never a single unified nation, not even close. As you can see broken down here, they were a vast, really diverse collection of fiercely independent tribes. The Romans called the ones in modern-day France the Gauls. You had the Helvetii over in Switzerland, the Boii in Central Europe, and up in Britain, tribes like the Brigantes and, of course, Boudica's own people, the Iceni. So while they shared art styles, languages, and cultural traits, politically, they were highly fractured and actually went to war with each other pretty often.
Section 3. Power of Celtic Women.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. It's absolutely vital to understand why a woman like Boudica could even rise to power in the first place. This comparison right here tells you everything you need to know. While Roman women were heavily restricted, Celtic women held extraordinary authority. They were protected by the ancient Bregon laws, meaning they could own property, keep their full estate if they were widowed, lead their tribes, and actually fight in battles. Contrast that with the deeply patriarchal Romans, where men literally held the power of life and death over their families. To Rome, the political and social power of a woman like Boudica wasn't just strange, it was completely shocking.
And we have the hard archaeological evidence to back up this high status, 480. That is the weight, in grams, of a stunning 24-karat solid gold torque found in the Vix grave of a Celtic princess from way back around 500 BC.
The Vix grave in France is just an unbelievable discovery. It visually proves the immense wealth, status, and deep reverence afforded to female Celtic elites centuries before Boudica was even born. The Lady of Vix, who was around 30 to 35 years old, was buried in a massive freestanding wooden wagon chamber, totally surrounded by intricate jewelry and imported luxury goods. It clearly shows that women could, and absolutely did, hold supreme social rank. Because of this deep-rooted cultural respect, Boudica definitely wasn't an anomaly. She was part of a long, proud lineage of powerful queens and mythical warrior women. History gives us figures like Cardamandua, a very real queen who ruled the massive Brigantes tribe in northern Britain. And if you look at Celtic myth, it's packed with equally formidable women, like Scathic, the legendary warrior who trained heroes, or Queen Med of Connacht, who famously led an entire army just to steal a prized bull. You kind of just can't make that up.
Section 4. Celtic Methods of Lore.
So, when Boudica's 100,000 warriors gathered under her command, how did they actually fight? Well, their warfare was incredibly psychological and just completely chaotic. As you can see, they prioritized personal glory and terrifying headlong infantry charges over strict Roman discipline. They wielded beautifully crafted long iron swords, fought from ridiculously fast, maneuverable chariots, and yes, they engaged in headhunting, believing the human head actually housed the soul. It was a style of warfare specifically designed to intimidate and literally shatter an enemy line through sheer aggressive force.
But right behind Boudica's screaming warriors stood the Druids. These were highly revered religious leaders who acted as everything from spiritual guides to top political advisors. Having them on the battlefield was meant to guarantee divine assistance and pump up the warriors' courage. According to Roman sources, the Druids even oversaw rituals and sacrifices right there in the combat zone to secure victory, adding this highly mystical, deeply terrifying dimension to the Celtic war machine.
Now, a quick caveat, and it's a big one. To be completely impartial here, we have to remember that we rely almost entirely on the writings of their enemies to piece this together. Writers like Julius Caesar and Cassius Dio unquestionably exaggerated the whole barbarian narrative, painting the Celts as chaotic, wild, and backward, especially for being led by warrior women, was incredibly useful wartime propaganda. It was the perfect excuse to justify expensive Roman military conquests to the folks back home in Rome.
All right, back to the main event. Section 5, Boudica's massive revolt.
Let's trace this explosive timeline. It's 60 CE, and taking advantage of the Roman governor being completely distracted with a campaign in Wales, Boudica's massive army sweeps across the province. In rapid, brutal succession, they burn 3 major Roman cities straight to the ground. Camulodunum, which is modern Colchester, Londinium, which is modern London, and Verulamium, modern St. Albans. And this wasn't just a minor skirmish. Archaeologists today can literally still find a thick layer of red, burnt ash underneath these cities, a physical remnant of the sheer fury of Boudica's forces.
It was a brutal take-no-prisoners campaign. Roman historians like Cassius Dio claimed the Celts engaged in horrific acts, like impaling Roman captives while celebrating and conducting sacrifices in the sacred groves of their war goddess, Andite. Now, while the absolute destruction of those cities was unquestionably real, we again have to read between the lines of this wartime propaganda, recognizing that Dio was actively trying to emphasize the savagery of Rome's enemies. But despite the initial overwhelming devastation, Boudica's campaign would ultimately meet a tragic end for the Celts at the Battle of Watling Street.
Section 6. The Lasting Celtic Legacy.
So, what should you really take away from this explainer? Well, Boudica's defeat essentially ended Celtic military dominance in Britain, very much like the fall of the Gallic leader Vercingetorix over in France a century earlier. But, and this is absolutely crucial, the Celts did not disappear. While Roman culture totally blanketed Gaul and southern Britain, elements of the Celtic world stubbornly endured on the fringes of Europe, in places where Roman law and eventually Anglo-Saxon influence just couldn't fully penetrate. Places like Ireland, the Scottish Highlands, Wales, and Brittany, the Celtic heartbeat kept right on thumping.
In fact, that legacy is literally still being spoken aloud today. As this breakdown shows, 6 distinct Celtic languages, divided into the Goidelic and Brythonic branches, have miraculously survived. Thanks to the incredibly tireless efforts of local communities, teachers, and cultural advocates, languages like Welsh, Irish, and Scottish Gaelic are keeping that ancient, direct connection to the Celtic world completely alive right now in the 21st century.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating final thought to ponder. We know Boudica mostly through the terrified, highly biased eyes of the very empire she tried to burn to the ground. If the Celts had been the ones to write the history books, if they had recorded their own story, how would we remember the warrior queen today? It really begs the question of how much of our history is shaped solely by the victors and what incredible, diverse human stories are still waiting to be uncovered in the ashes. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.